Welcome everybody. I hope you can see and hear me. And this is the first of the online talks we're trying, so maybe one or two teething problems today. We hope not. This is a substitute for the real thing. It's just as good, but in a different way. We're not going to be tramping outdoors. And what we don't cover, if you like, geographically walking through the landscape, I'm going to give you in a chronological account of the development of the 18th century landscape. Of course, there's much more history to come after the 18th century. Well, halfway along the 5 Mile Avenue that forms the dramatic approach to Castle Howard stands the obelisk built by John Vanbrugh in 1714, signalling the head of the drive that leads down to the house. In 1731, Charles Howard, 3rd Earl of Carlisle, added 2 sets of inscriptions for the base of the 70-foot shaft. The first in Latin commemorated the victories of the Duke of Marlborough. The second, on the west side and in English, was a more personal statement. The inscription opened with a conditional speculation. If to perfection these plantations rise, if they agreeably my heirs surprise, this faithful pillar will their age declare. And the lines concluded by memorializing the great building achievements of Carlisle with his architects Vanbrugh and Hawksmoor. Charles, the 3rd Earl of Carlisle, of the family of the Howards, erected a castle where the old castle of Henderscell stood, and called it Castle Howard. He likewise made the plantations in this park, and all the outworks, monuments, and other plantations belonging to the said seat. Well, looking up and down the avenue from the obelisks, it's easy to see what Carlyle meant by the word plantations, which he used 3 times in the text. The long columns of trees planted along the border of the road. Great swathes of trees stretched elsewhere across the entire estate, either along geometrical axes or in blocks of existing ancient woodland. By 1727, the date of this estate map on the top left, many of these trees planted in the first decade of the 18th century would still have been young. But in woodlands such as Raywood, which I'm circling with my cursor on the photograph below, Raywood, Prettywood at the bottom of the screen of the photograph here, and Mount Zion Wood to the left of the Mausoleum, these would have been mature plantations. And in his inscription, Carlyle was commemorating what we might call the green fashioning of the Castle Howard landscape, the introduction of new schemes or the shaping of existing plantations with rides, walkways and other features. Of course, these great tracts of woodland would also in time constitute a valuable cash crop for his descendants. Oak and beech or similar hardwoods could be harvested for their timber, anything from 80 to 120 years upwards after their planting. The inscription, therefore, is written with dynastic and economic posterity in mind. Well, today the plantations Carlyle spoke of so confidently continue to surprise in an agreeable manner. The 9,000-acre estate divides roughly into 5,000 acres of farmland, 2,000 acres of woodland, and 2,000 acres of gardens, lakes, and immediate parkland. Although most of the woodlands have at some point been felled and replanted, the early 18th century design of the landscape remains remarkably intact. Well, I've begun this talk with trees, but let's look at another kind of planting, one that accompanied these extensive forestry operations. In the first half of the 18th century, Carlisle and Vanbrugh and Hawksmoor planted this corner of Yorkshire with a mass of architectural and sculptural delights, which, acting in concert with the grand mansion and the natural terrain, the very contours of the Howardian hills, and its trees, waterways, and open parkland, produced a sublime landscape. And much of what we recognize as the 18th century core of this extraordinary building and landscaping project was completed in just over 4 decades, beginning in 1699 and more or less finished by 1740. Today, we can marvel at this accomplishment in the same way as Carlyle's contemporaries did. But how did it all come about? Well, the project was indeed an extraordinary transformation of the Yorkshire landscape. And we can begin to see this by turning to an estate map of 1694 before any work on Castle Howard began. In the top left, we see the full extent of the map, and the bottom right, a close-up detail, where you'll notice on the left-hand side of the picture, this red square, which is the old castle, and look at this green area to the right, which is Ray Wood. I'm now going to produce an even more detailed close-up of the castle and village of Henderskelf. What we see is the castle lined on an east-west axis with two funny little projecting wings, a courtyard with gateways, and behind it lawns and parterres, sometimes known as the bowling green. As for the village itself, we can see the high street marked in yellow here that proceeds from west to east and then detours around the castle compound, passing the little church which straddled the castle grounds and then picking up in an easterly direction after the castle itself. And you can see that the street is marked with little representations of houses and the land holdings that these dwellers would have had. And the street continues at the foot of Ray Wood. Well, virtually all of this was to be erased in the next decade or so. And one of the human consequences of Carlyle's decision to transform his home and surrounding landscape was the displacement of the village and its inhabitants, who were absorbed into outlying settlements. And today, the only trace of the village that remains is the terrace that leads southeast from the house to Vanbrugh's temple. And this follows the route of that old main street of the village. Now, Carlyle's first choice of architect was William Talman on the left here. But after dismissing him in the summer of 1699, he turned to his fellow Kit Kat Club member, Sir John Vanbrugh, here on the right, who proposed a bolder and more exciting design for a house, which appealed to the ambitious Carlyle. And he also repositioned the building, which was going to have important consequences for the layout of the grounds. And from this early moment, there date a pair of garden designs, which show the respective Talman and Vanbrugh house positionings, together with proposals for formal gardens. Both these plans are attributed to George London, nurseryman and leading garden designer of the day. And he's renowned for his formal garden designs with their intricate geometry, a style that owed much to prevailing French and Dutch influences. Now, the first proposal, accompanying William Talman's house plan, shows the building on an east-west axis, just as the old castle itself had been. It's looking out over a forecourt with gate piers along a narrow approach from the west. To the north of the house, there's a series of ornamental ponds and plantations, and to the south, a set of compartments clearly designed to receive parterres and lawns. To the northeast, you'll see that Ray Wood has been carved into a set of stars and walkways. This would have probably involved quite a lot of felling of the old mature woodland. And the other thing to notice in the bottom left corner here to the southwest is the circular model village proposed to replace the old medieval Henderskelf. The main thing to think about this house is that its axis on the east-west means that it would not directly have overlooked the ponds to the north nor the gardens to the south. If we now look at the second garden proposal with a Vanbrugh house plan, you can see that immediately the house has been turned 90 degrees to face north-south. Here we have a slightly different configuration of canals and ponds and plantations, which the house would look directly over, and to the south, an area which would have received a parterre. Importantly, to the east, Ray Wood would not have been so comprehensively felled, but would have been left with these star-shaped rides and avenues. And you still have another variant on the circular model village to the southwest. Now, had either of these proposals been executed, then the early landscape at Castle Howard might have looked similar to these two examples. Top left, Denham Place in Buckinghamshire, and on the right, Pierrepoint House in Nottinghamshire. These are contemporary paintings that show small formal compartments and geometrical enclosures aligned axially with the main house. This is how Castle Howard might have looked, but this was not the case, because a more innovative garden layout was favoured, experimenting with the surrounding landscape in different ways. And in fact, the gardens and grounds were unanimously praised for ushering in a new and more natural kind of gardening, very different from those influenced by the continental manner. And actually, it's to Ray Wood that we must look in these early years of the 18th century for evidence of a revolution in taste, as this ancient woodland was transformed into an exciting garden filled with architectural and sculptural features. And clearly, one of the reasons why Ray Wood was the first area to be developed was because it was removed from the immediate vicinity of the house. Let's not forget that at this time, this would have been little more than a vast building site. Now, an early sketch of the ground to the northeast of the house, seen here on the left of the screen, shows the outline of Ray Wood with a bastion wall begun in 1703 and entrance piers, which we know were erected in 1705. But marked out in this plan in a cursory way are the beginnings of a sequence of straight walkways punctuated by circular openings. Now, this preliminary sketch suggests a semi-formal pattern of paths, avoiding the strict geometry of George London's proposals. But at some point, these walkways developed into a mazy and irregular network of paths, praised by the contemporary garden writer Stephen Switzer as a labyrinth diverting model. Now, the only record we have of this scheme is how they appeared in a rather attenuated form on an estate map of 1773, seen here on the top left of the screen. And you can begin to see some of the winding pathways that are marked out in the map. You can still see them today with aerial views, particularly in winter. You can begin to see the traces of pathways here. And on the right-hand side, we have a 1940 aerial picture from the Ordnance survey, just after Ray Wood had been clear-felled. And you can see the delicate little tracery of the original paths that snaked through the woods. And these paths were so intricate that there's a famous incident when members of the Howard family once became lost in the wood and had to be rescued by their servants. Well, the openings in the wood at this time were varied in shape, some circular, others square, and one even diamond-shaped, all designed to generate space, surprise, and impact as the pedestrian would have emerged from winding paths into each clearing filled with features, either sculpted or planted, or a mixture of both. And their impact can be gauged by looking at these two contemporary French examples from Versailles and the Chateau of Marly on the top of the screen. And we also know that Hawksmoor was responsible for much of the design of the wood, including the sophisticated waterworks in there, which included fountains and a cascade. And this is a drawing that has been recently discovered by a scholar, funnily enough, at Wilton House in Wiltshire, nowhere near Castle Howard, but in a collection of drawings there. And this shows a sketch in Hawksmoor's hand of how he envisaged the wood to look with its water features. And Ray Wood was not a densely planted area of new growth. It was a combination of ancient woodland with large mature trees of various species and no doubt some newer plantings. But taken together, all these features, sculpture, buildings, waterworks, vegetation, would have combined to present a theatre of incident in Ray Wood. Each turn of the paths would have presented a new spectacle, generating surprising or familiar sights. And a profusion of lead sculptures populated the wood too. Figures that survive in the grounds today are there because they were relocated when this ensemble of waterworks, pavilions, and sculpture fell into decay in the middle of the 18th century. And one of the most admired figures was actually not made of lead. This was carved out of stone. It is Apollo holding his lyre and standing on a large ornate pedestal, both carved by the Huguenot craftsman Henri Nadold, who worked inside the house as well. And originally the statue and pedestal were located in Ray Wood, but repositioned in the 19th century to the south of the house. Now, the detailed carving on the base in particular elicited widespread admiration from observant visitors. John Tracy Atkins, visiting in 1732, declared it one of the prettiest things I ever saw. The basis at a distance seems a rude heap of stone, but when you come nearer, you may see in it all the variety of prospect that the country can afford. Villages, rocks, mountains, cataracts of water rolling down, and everything that can be beautiful in a landscape carved on each side of it. And today, all this crisp detail is still visible and remarkably intact. And it's amazing how many visitors to Castle Howard actually fail to notice this exquisite design in the pedestal to Apollo. And it's something that we would have looked close up at on our tour had it taken place this month. Now, Carlyle's purchase of statues continued into the 1720s. And this is a bill from the archives of 1723 from Andrew Carpenter, manufactured lead sculptures in London. And he supplied 4 figures: Hercules, a Spartan boy, Venus, and a faun. And these line today the terrace alongside the temple. Accompanying the bill also was an important list of all the other figures that Carpenter could supply from his yard, along with their prices. And this was the era when lead sculptures could be purchased virtually off the shelf at relatively low cost, especially when compared to the price of, say, individual commissions in bronze or marble. This is the age of mass production of lead sculpture. But along with the temple terrace, the south parterre also became the major assembly point for much of this sculpture. And in 1725, the famous bird's eye view of the house and grounds appeared in the 3rd volume of Vitruvius Britannicus. The image is, of course, an idealized one, for the house was unfinished at this time. It still lacked the west wing and the service buildings on the west side, as depicted in the view. The area behind the house was fashioned in a slightly different manner than we see in the engraving. And we can look at this in the detail in the 1727 estate map. And what it does confirm is that this symmetrical wilderness made out of fir trees was in fact built, and so corresponded more or less with the view we see in the engraving. And importantly, we know that this area was built, particularly with the boundary walls, because aerial views in recent times have shown the ghostly outlines of those walls in the ploughed field to the south. And you can see them marked in with the red arrows here. It's a wonderful idea, but maybe we should think about restoring that one day. A terrific addition to the 18th century. And this map also records a dense arrangement of statues, obelisks, a large column, and numerous urns and vases all about the south parterre on the lawns immediately behind the house, all marked in here. And again, this can be corroborated by a wonderful painting by an unknown artist. This painting doesn't hang at Castle Howard, but it shows the southwest corner of the house, but you have a sideways glimpse of the parterre, showing raised lawns and terraces, but also statues, urns and vases, obelisks, 4 of them, and in more detail you see beyond there would have been the central column as well as more statues. So generally, the pedestrian experience at Castle Howard is an exhilarating one. The terrain is varied and extensive. There are lawns, terraces, woodlands, waterways, sculpture, monuments, and prime views across great distances. This is landscape design on a heroic scale. And 2 particular features signaled to one another across the landscape. The first was Vanbrugh's Temple of Diana, located at the southeast corner of the wood, built in the 1720s, and nowadays known as the Temple of the Four Winds. And it owes its form to Andrea Palladio's famous 16th century Villa Rotonda at Vicenza. And the similarities are striking, especially when the buildings are viewed from the same angle, slightly below and to one side. Each is essentially a cube with a dome and porticos on each elevation. and decorated with pediments on the. Well designed as a pavilion in which to take refreshment or pursue leisure activities, the interior of the temple, decorated with scagliola by the Italian stuccoist Francesco Vassalli, was not completed until 1739. And busts of Roman emperors and empresses rest in these rather unusual circular recesses above the doorways. And the dome itself is spectacularly decorated with gilded plasterwork. Now, a quarter of a mile away, once stood Hawksmoor's Temple of Venus, dating from the 1730s. It was an open rotunda with 8 columns supporting a heavy entablature with a chunky lead-lined cap on top. And the weight of this superstructure was clearly enormous, and as the stone decayed from rusting iron cramps and water and frost damage, the structure became less and less stable. And by the 30s, the time of these two images, the statue of Venus and her pedestal had been removed and relocated inside the walled garden, and the temple was shored up with timber. A few years later, it disappeared, deliberately flattened by a tree during the clear felling of Raywood in 1943-44. And today, the base has been cleared, recovering its octagonal. Well, Vanbrugh's temple and Hawksmoor's temple answered one another architecturally on the eastern border of Raywood. Here is the platform for the Temple of Venus, and here is the Temple of the Four Winds today. They dominate this edge of Raywood and obviously the border with the parkland. They were eye catchers, each on their respective platforms, visible one from the other. But Carlyle was planting the landscape even further afield during these decades, and dating from the late 1720s is the first of the mock fortification walls the visitor encounters on the approach along the avenue from the south, the Carmire Gate by Hawksmoor, with its chunky arch, heavy keystones, Gothic crenellations, and polygonal turrets at either end of the curtain wall. And it serves as a prelude to Vanbrugh's Pyramid Gatehouse a mile further along the avenue, erected in 1719 initially as just a pyramid arch, but with wings added later in the 1750s by Sir Thomas Robinson. And then stretching out either side of the gatehouse for half a mile are the mock fortifications begun around 1720. These recall not just the medieval walls of Chester, Vanbrugh's early hometown, but of course the walls of nearby York, and too the walls of ancient Rome, which themselves were studded with bastions, turrets, and pyramids, just like these at Castle Howard. In terms of pyramids, Hawksmoor was to extend this motif with his own brace of pyramids, situated to the east along the same ridge as the gatehouse. And his large pyramid of 1728 is set on a low plinth and flanked by four pairs of angled piers. It's hollow, and the corbelled interior contains a gigantic bust of the Earl's 3 times great-grandfather, Lord William Howard, the Tudor founder of this branch of the family. And this again would have been a structure we would have gone inside on our tour this month, and I hope we can do that later in the year. And then there's the final structure planted in the landscape, the grandest monument of them all, Hawksmoor's Mausoleum, begun in 1729. But like so much else at Castle Howard, it's the result of incremental progress. What's so extraordinary about the 18th century landscape here is that it grows in an organic and integrated fashion. There was no master plan, no great blueprint drawn up in, say, 1700 with a schedule of work set out. The monuments build upon one another, fueled in part by the tremendously creative, competitive dynamic between Vanbrugh and Hawksmoor. One man offers a temple, a few years later, the other does. One man builds mock medieval walls, so does the other shortly afterwards. One sites a pyramid in the landscape, 10 years later, so does the other. It's therefore wholly logical that the siting of the mausoleum on the natural promontory of Mount Zion Hill should have been accompanied in the 1730s by the widening of a small stream into the serpentine river known as New River, which you can see in the middle ground of this photograph here. And in 1740, it would receive its own bridge. And many people believe that New River Bridge is a folly. It comes from nowhere and it goes to nowhere. But this is not so. It forms the principal access route to the mausoleum. Carriages would progress over the bridge with coffin and entourage en route to the interment in the vaults of the mausoleum. As for the building itself, it evolved through a number of design stages and influences before its finished form was agreed upon. It drew upon Roman buildings, both ancient and recent, including on the left, Bramante's Tempietto, and on the right, the ancient tomb of Gallienus on the Appian Way, just outside the Roman city. But at one point in the design discussions, Carlyle requested a colonnade instead of the original proposed arcade, and Hawksmoor supplied him with this comparative elevation. And the edifice was to rest on a small square plinth and thus be seen to rise dramatically out of the landscape at the top of the hill. Well, the final version of the mausoleum, completed after Hawksmoor's death in 1737, bore only a partial resemblance to this vision. The steps on the eastern side that you can see in the bottom image, a heavy but practical addition, were added at the suggestion of Lord Burlington. And the Bastion Wall, that's visible in the aerial view on the top left, was added by Daniel Garrett in the early 1740s. This undid Hawksmoor's intended effect of a cylindrical building thrusting out of the hilltop. But today it is possible to finesse this view, as you can see on the right, with the contours of the land, but only from certain angles and points in the landscape. Inside, on the upper level, is the chapel, lit by large windows and a clerestory some 70 feet high. Carved rosettes decorate the ceiling, modelled on the Pantheon in Rome, and the 8 fluted Corinthian columns inside the chapel are fully recessed and respond to the 20 Doric columns of the colonnade outside. But perhaps the ultimate confirmation of Carlyle's dynastic aspirations lies in the fact that the mausoleum is still, today, the private burial place of the Howard family. Beneath the chapel is the crypt, with a central vaulted chamber linked to a circular passageway around the perimeter, with 4 small subchambers. And the catacombs contain 63 niches or loculi, less than half of which are filled today. This is a building designed to endure just as long as the family. And realizing that his public star had waned long ago, Carlyle determined to raise the most comprehensive monument possible, an entire landscape that would dwarf the ephemeral glories of political life and last well beyond his own lifetime. In these early decades of the century, Carlyle transformed the sleepy village of Henderskelf into a unified domain, the huge, sophisticated landscaped environment of Castle Howard, as marked out in the map of 1727. And even the name, Castle Howard, conflates territorial, architectural, and dynastic aspirations. And there can be no doubt that whatever the disappointments Carlyle suffered in his public career, his decision to refashion this corner of England in his own image was an enduring success. And so this brings us back to the inscription on the obelisk, recording a vision and a determination that would ensure that all these plantings endured: the house, the monuments, the very family itself, and of course, the wider designed landscape. Consequently, Castle Howard has to be understood as a totality, the buildings in relation to the landscape and vice versa. We're missing the breadth of that early vision if we consider each component in isolation. The unity of the built and the natural heritage is key to its meaning. And of course, whilst all this was going on, the avenue with its new plantations was slowly maturing in a quiet way, as it still does today after extensive restoration work in recent years, which will be the subject of a future talk. What remains, of course, is the most spectacular backdrop for arriving at and departing from Castle Howard. Created in the 18th century, it is the most memorable landscape in Britain. Now, of course, match was to happen in later centuries, and the landscape continues to evolve to this day. But that's the subject for another talk. So thank you very much for listening. And with Matt's help, I'm very happy now to take questions from you, either by audio, or if you rather email in with questions. I know one of you has already. I can try and respond to those by email. So Matt, perhaps we can think about the Q&A session now. Yes, the first questions I've got to hand was from Gail. Thank you for that. You asked whether the monuments were the ideas of the architects involved and how much the Earl was involved, or indeed others. The answer to that is not a simple one. I mean, I think we always credit three men principally with building Castle Howard: the Earl himself, Vanbrugh, and Hawksmoor. These were the principal players. But certainly with the later design of the landscape, and particularly the mausoleum, there were other outside influences. Lord Burlington, the young fourth Earl of Carlisle, these were both great enthusiasts for the new style of Palladian architecture, and Burlington's protege, Daniel Garrett. And the best way to understand how each of these men were involved in the design of the buildings and landscape is actually to look at their correspondence, and their correspondence has been published. Vanbrugh letters were published in a handsome edition in the 1920s that's easily available, should be in a good library. And similarly, Hawksmoor's letters have been published in 2 editions in a journal in the 1920s, all the letters relating to the mausoleum. And that shows how he was coming under pressure from Burlington and people to change the design. And a number of letters are also reproduced in the late Kerry Downes's scholarly monograph. If you want full imprint details of those, I can send them to you by email. So I hope that sort of begins to answer the question. There's no, I'm afraid, smoking gun document where the Earl says, I definitely want this and I definitely want it to look like that. You follow the kind of gestation of these buildings through things like the architect's letters, contemporary visitors' accounts, and actually the building account books too, which record the building work.
And we've had a question from Nicola and from Paul and Catherine, all asking the same thing, actually. Chris, where can we find the statue of Apollo that you referred to in the talk?
Right, it's easy to find. It's to the south side of the house. Basically, the simplest thing would be to go down the Lime Avenue, which is alongside the walled garden. The gateway into the walled garden is in that Lime Avenue. And right at the end of that avenue, in a terminal point, you will see that pyramid base with Apollo standing at the top of it. And as you get close to it, you'll think it's just standing on a kind of rudimentary heap of stones. But when you really get close up, you'll see that fantastic detail. So it's very simple to find in the south side of the house.
Thanks, Chris. And another question from Bob Gardner saying, was the lake always there?
I haven't touched on the lakes today, Bob. Sorry about that. I mean, there's a limit to what we can do in the time available. Now, the lakes, all of the lakes you see at Castle Howard, the South Lake and the Great Lake to the north, as well as the ponds and the rivers, these are all man-made features. The South Lake was designed in the 1720s. The Great Lake to the north was begun in the 1790s, and the configuration of ponds around it were altered in the 19th and 20th centuries too. And New River, as I said, was built in the 1730s. The fountains that you see today and the cascade and the waterfall, those are all 19th century additions by the Victorian landscape gardener, William Andrews Nesfield. And that whole later period of garden design and development is, I hope, going to be the subject of another talk in the future.
Thank you very much. Another question here from Nicola. Does anyone live in the gatehouse shown at the top of your screen? If not, what is it used for? And I think you actually lived in there yourself for a little bit at one point.
The gatehouse began life as an inn. When the wings were added in the 1750s, it was a hostelry, an inn. And it never seemed to be very successful. It was taken over by a succession of kind of proprietors, and it always seemed to struggle. They tried to combine running the inn with some of the adjacent farmland. At the end of the 19th century, it was used as a temperance inn for families from the urban districts of the West Riding. The 9th Countess would allow them to come and stay for summer holidays. And then in the 20th century, it was inhabited during the Second World War by the Howard family, who vacated the house when Queen Margaret's School had been evacuated there. And in the 1950s, briefly George Howard lived there, and then members of the family up until the end of the 1980s. Then it was lived in by the agent at Castle Howard, and I spent about 3 months living in there. On the, as you're looking at it on the screen today, on the right-hand compartment. The left-hand compartment is nearly derelict, having been damaged in a fire in the 1930s. I mean, it's still roofed, but empty inside. The eventual aim is to try and restore this building. It requires a lot of money to make it wind and watertight. And we've looked at various options, perhaps to turn it into a hotel or into offices. All of these things that need to be looked at very seriously in terms of their economics. Are they a viable proposition? But the idea is to bring that building back online when it becomes feasible to do so.
Thank you very much. Another question, are the pyramids just a fashion of the time, or do they have a greater meaning?
Well, pyramids, of course, begin life in Egypt. They migrate to Rome, and then, like a lot of architectural styles, they migrate further north into Europe and then eventually reaching England. Pyramids are kind of become very appealing to antiquarians and travelers in the 17th century. They're fascinated with their technology and also with what they mean, particularly as burial chambers for the pharaohs. In England, they have a variety of kind of associations and significances. Clearly, the big pyramid that Hawksmoor builds to the east of the Gatehouse, that functions as a tomb in the sense that it has a representation of the family's great-great-great ancestor, Lord William Howard, from the 16th century. So in that respect, it is, if you like, a tomb, albeit with a sculpted representation of the member of the family inside it. The pyramid that you see on the top of the arch for the Gatehouse in the middle of the screen at the moment, that was, again, initially built as a triumphal arch that evoked those arches that you would find in Rome. And that pyramid too is hollow, and that's how you get on the upper level from the left-hand side of the Gatehouse to the right-hand side of the Gatehouse. And inside that area, there's a rather wonderful little room that has water tanks and things in it. So it was a kind of practical space, as well as being a striking architectural kind of statement. There is, in fact, another solid pyramid even further east in Prettywood that Hawksmoor put up in the 1720s, very early 1730s too. But I haven't been able to show that in this presentation.
Okay, thank you very much. And one more question here. Why was Raywood cleared in the 1940s?
The reason it was cleared in the 1940s, I suspect, is that simply the wood was mature, or it was past maturity, but I dare say a lot of it could have been used for the war effort. So that's why it was clear felled and the timbers taken away, probably used for pit props in mining, all sorts of things to help the war effort. And so that hilltop was bare for about 20 years until it began to be replanted in the 1960s. And that has allowed us to reinstate some vision of those serpentine pathways that date from the 18th century.